March 30th, 2026, Sunday, and the question that has been sitting underneath every major power scandal of the last decade just got a documented answer that nobody was prepared for. Where did Jeffrey Epstein hide the evidence? Not theoretically. Not as internet speculation assembled from fragments of court filings and secondhand accounts, and the specific mythology that accumulates around cases this explosive when the formal legal process fails to produce the full picture that everyone watching knows must exist somewhere, documented, in emails, in financial records, in the specific paper trail generating reality of a man who was meticulous enough about his own protection to hire private investigators, pay them through identifiable financial channels, move computers and paperwork out of his properties before search warrants arrived, lease storage units across Florida and New York for over a decade, and leave behind a correspondence record that is now on March 30th, 2026, being examined by investigators, reported on by the Telegraph, and placed into the public record in ways that are generating the specific, seismic kind of attention that follows when a piece of information that changes the shape of an entire story becomes impossible to contain. Storage lockers, multiple of them, across Florida and New York, with documented payment trails showing monthly charges as high as nearly $400 running for years, with emails from Epstein to his staff explicitly requesting motion-detected hidden cameras that record, with communications about wiping computers clean, with a private investigator named William Riley writing to Epstein's attorneys to say he had computers and paperwork he took from Epstein's house prior to the search warrant locked in storage, and asking what he should do with them prior to the search warrant. He took the computers and paperwork out before the investigators arrived, and according to the reporting that is spreading across every platform on March 30th, 2026, according to the Telegraph's investigation into financial records and email correspondence from the Epstein files that were recently released under the Epstein Files Transparency Act, U.S. authorities never searched these storage lockers. Never. In a case that has generated more public scrutiny, more investigative journalism, more congressional attention, and more cultural conversation about the relationship between extreme wealth and the absence of accountability than almost any other case in modern American history. The specific locations where the most incriminating material may have been stored were apparently never examined by the people whose job it was to examine them. Stay with this until the very end, because the final piece, the specific connection between what is now being documented about Epstein's storage infrastructure and the ongoing Diddy case, and what Kefti's testimony about Diddy's alleged involvement in the Tupac murder has placed in the formal legal record, is the piece that makes March 30th, 2026, the day that multiple enormous stories that have been running parallel suddenly start converging in the same direction. Before we get into everything, like this video, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell. This is one of those days where multiple major stories are moving simultaneously. You need to be here for all of it. Now let's go all the way in. March 30th, 2026. And to understand the full weight of what the Epstein storage locker revelations mean, you have to understand what has been released through the Epstein Files Transparency Act, and what the specific documentation now in the public record shows about how this man operated. The FBI said in the released files that they do not have evidence of photos or videos of other people abusing girls or women. That statement, which has been cited by people who want to argue that the most explosive allegations about what Epstein was doing, the specific claim that he was recording powerful men in compromising situations with underage girls and using those recordings as blackmail leverage to build and maintain his network, were never substantiated by the formal investigation. But the storage locker documentation, now public, suggests a different explanation for that absence. If computers and materials were moved out of Epstein's properties before search warrants arrived, those materials would not be in the FBI's possession. If storage units across Florida and New York were never searched, their contents would not appear in any FBI inventory. If the documentation showing what was stored and where was never obtained and examined, the evidentiary record would reflect not the absence of incriminating material, but the absence of a search that would have located it. The FBI may not have what was in those lockers, not because it did not exist, but because it was specifically, deliberately, methodically moved to prevent them from finding it. And because, for reasons that are now becoming the subject of intense scrutiny, those storage locations were apparently never searched. The email from William Riley to Epstein's attorneys is the document at the center of this. I have them locked in storage and would like to know what to do with them. They are no longer needed in the criminal case, I assume. Is it possible to give you these items for your review and safekeeping? Computers. Paperwork, taken from Epstein's house before the search warrant, locked in storage, with the question of what to do with them being directed to the attorneys who are also coordinating the legal defense. The cloning detail is equally significant. Roy Black directed that the computer drives be cloned, and the cloning was done by a forensic specialist. Computer drives taken from a property before a search warrant, cloned by a forensic specialist at the direction of the lead defense attorney. Whatever was on those drives existed in multiple copies, distributed to multiple people, in locations that investigators apparently never examined. The email from Epstein himself to a staff member in 2014 requires no interpretation. Let's get 3 motion-detected hidden cameras that record. That is not ambiguous. That is a man who had already been convicted of solicitation of a minor, who had already served time and entered the sex offender registry, who was operating a network of properties in multiple jurisdictions under ongoing legal scrutiny, asking his staff to install motion-detected hidden cameras that record. The earlier email sent to Epstein in the same year adds a specific detail that the Telegraph's reporting highlights for its implications. Remember what we spoke about? If you want to put cameras in the house, it will have to be very discreetly done. The Russians may come in handy. That line. The Russians may come in handy. In the context of documented allegations that Epstein had ties to Russian officials, possibly the Russian government itself, and in the context of what the hidden cameras were presumably being used to capture, the implication is that the infrastructure for recording compromising footage of powerful visitors was not being constructed independently, but was being built with the assistance of foreign intelligence resources, which would explain something that has always been difficult to explain about the Epstein operation. Why would a man with Epstein's resources, operating in the specific world of ultra-high net worth finance and the power networks that surround it, take the specific risks he was taking unless the blackmail leverage those risks produced was valuable enough to justify them? And who was it valuable to beyond Epstein himself? The hidden camera emails suggest the recordings existed. The storage locker emails suggest the recordings were moved before investigators could find them. The fact that the storage lockers were apparently never searched suggests that either the investigators did not know about them or knew about them and did not act, or something in between those two explanations that is less comfortable than either. Now let's talk about the Diddy connection. Because on March 30th, 2026, the Epstein storage locker story and the ongoing Diddy case are not separate threads. They are part of the same larger examination of what happens when extreme wealth and institutional power combine to create networks of mutual protection around conduct that would otherwise be criminally prosecutable. Diddy is inside Fort Dix, serving 10 years. His trial for the federal charges, racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking through force, fraud and coercion, transportation to engage in prostitution, is generating ongoing legal proceedings that touch the same questions the Epstein storage locker story is now raising at a structural level. How do powerful men who engage in systematic abuse of vulnerable people sustain that abuse for decades without institutional intervention? What mechanisms of protection were operating? Who knew and said nothing? And where is the evidence that should have produced accountability years or decades before it finally arrived? The KFD trial in Las Vegas is where the Diddy thread and the deeper power network thread converge most directly on March 30th, 2026. Because KFD's testimony, the specific, formally placed, legally documented claim that Diddy offered him $1 million to kill both Tupac Shakur and Suge Knight, is not an allegation that exists only in internet speculation and documentary footage. It is in the formal legal record of an active murder trial. It is the basis for the prosecution's case against KFDD, and it names Diddy by name as the person who initiated and funded the arrangement that produced what happened on September 7th, 1996 in Las Vegas. The DEA report from a 2008 task force meeting with Davis kept act that is included in the motion filings is explicit. At a meeting at Greenblatt's restaurant in Hollywood, Combs summoned Davis into the downstairs area. Combs again told Davis that he needed to get rid of Knight and Shakur. Combs offered Davis $1 million to handle the problem, and then the specific, devastating detail about what happened immediately after Tupac was shot. Well, at the restaurant, Martin told Davis that Combs had called Martin and asked, "Was that us?" Davis asked Martin when he would receive compensation for the shooting. Martin told Davis he would get the money when he returns to New York. Additionally, while at the restaurant, Combs called Martin again. Martin then handed the phone to Davis. Combs again inquired, "Was that us?" Davis recalled Combs sounding elated at the situation. Sounding elated at the news that the man whose death he had allegedly paid $1 million to arrange had been shot. This is in the formal legal record, not as a rumor, as testimony from the man currently awaiting trial for Tupac's murder, whose credibility is complicated by his history of changing stories, sometimes admitting involvement, sometimes denying it, but whose account of the specific conversation at Greenblatt's restaurant has been documented in multiple proceedings across multiple years in a way that is difficult to dismiss as fabrication. The parallel between the Epstein situation and the Diddy situation is not accidental, it is structural. Both cases involve men who used extreme wealth and institutional connections to sustain patterns of conduct for decades that should have generated legal consequences years earlier. Both cases involve documented evidence of recording, Epstein's hidden cameras in storage lockers, Diddy's own extensive personal footage that his videographer captured and that ended up in the documentary series. Both cases involve the specific question of what happened to the most incriminating material and whether the people responsible for finding it did everything they could to find it. In the Epstein case, the storage locker documentation suggests the answer to that last question may be no. Computers move before search warrants. Storage units leased for a decade with documented payment trails. Properties photographed with empty storage areas where the material might have been. And investigators who apparently never searched the specific locations where the most incriminating evidence was most likely stored. In the Diddy case, the 140 hours of additional footage that 50 Cent has referenced, material that he says exists beyond the Netflix documentary and that he has described as available for YouTube distribution without editorial filter, raises the same structural question from the opposite direction. Not what was hidden, but what was captured and is being held. What exists in the material that has not yet been released? What additional names are in the evidence that the Netflix distribution constraints required to be withheld from the first 4 episodes? Both questions, what Epstein hid in storage and what 50 Cent has not yet released, point toward the same structural reality. The most powerful people in networks like these do not operate alone. They operate within systems of mutual protection, systems where the recordings, the documentation, the specific evidence of what happened in the private rooms and on the private islands and in the invitation-only environments that the powerful built specifically to avoid public scrutiny, that evidence does not simply belong to one person. It belongs to the network, and its disposition, whether it is stored, destroyed, released, or used as leverage, is a negotiation between the people who hold it and the people who are implicated by it. The wiping communications from the Epstein emails are the piece of this story that lands hardest in the context of March 30th, 2026. Jeffrey, James would like you to get Redacted's computer and wipe it clean. Hey Les, Jay mentioned he wants Scott to wipe clean Ahmed's laptop today. Items in the PBI garage, possibly Palm Beach Island. Janice would like to review with you as he believes some items such as old computers once wiped can be discarded. These are not communications about standard IT maintenance. These are communications about the deliberate elimination of material that could be found and examined by investigators. They are the paper trail of a destruction operation that was ongoing, systematic, and clearly understood by everyone involved to be something different from the routine disposal of outdated equipment. and the specific detail about the CDs, the email asking what about all speakers box with CDs, the notation that computers and CDs were being transported from Little St. Cope, James Island to the storage units before being potentially wiped, is the element that connects most directly to the hidden camera infrastructure. If the cameras were recording, the recordings were going somewhere. CDs in storage, computers with cloned drives, materials moved before search warrants, stored in units that were never searched, potentially wiped when they were no longer needed for specific legal purposes. Where is all of that footage? That is the question that the Telegraph's reporting has placed at the center of the Epstein conversation on March 30th, 2026. And it is, structurally, the same question that the Diddy case has been circling since December 2nd, 2025. Not just who did what, but where is the documentation of what was done, who has it, and why have the people whose job it is to find it apparently been unable or unwilling to look in the places where it is most likely to be? The celebrity defense attorney interviewed about the Diddy-Tupac connection makes an argument that deserves engagement rather than dismissal. He says the Biggie involvement allegation is a 30-year-old accusation that smells wrong. He says Diddy's legal team will look for exactly these kinds of allegations, ones that can be disproved, to create reasonable doubt in the jury's minds about the broader indictment. He says that piling on allegations, some of which are weaker than others, might actually help Diddy in the courtroom. That is a legitimate legal argument. It is the argument that sophisticated defense attorneys make when they understand that the emotional atmosphere surrounding a case can sometimes be turned to the defendant's advantage, that juries, instructed to decide based on evidence rather than feeling, may actually react against the perception that someone is being pile-driven by accumulated accusation rather than properly adjudicated. But the legal argument and the structural argument are different things. The legal argument is about whether Kef D's specific testimony about Tupac, with its history of inconsistencies and changed details, is strong enough to survive the scrutiny of a criminal trial. The structural argument is about what the pattern of documentation across the Epstein files, the Diddy case, the Kef D testimony, the storage locker emails, the hidden camera requests, the computer wiping communications reveals about how powerful men in interconnected networks sustain conduct that should have been stopped decades earlier. The legal argument may result in acquittals. The structural argument may result in something more durable, a public understanding of the mechanisms of institutional protection that allow this conduct to continue. That is not dependent on any individual verdict for its validity. On March 30th, 2026, both arguments are being made simultaneously, in courtrooms in New York and Las Vegas, in congressional proceedings examining the Epstein files, in the 140 hours of documentary footage that has not yet been released, and the civil discovery of 150-plus active lawsuits against Combs, in the conversations between prosecutors in the Diddy case and prosecutors in the Kef D case that are reportedly ongoing. The storage locker question. The specific documented, now public evidence that Epstein moved materials before search warrants and leased storage units for a decade that were apparently never searched is the question that lands with the most force on March 30th, 2026, not because it produces new names or new allegations, but because it changes the structural understanding of what the formal investigation was and was not able to accomplish. If the FBI's statement that they do not have evidence of videos or photographs is accurate, and if the storage locker documentation suggests the most incriminating material was specifically removed from the properties that were searched and placed in locations that were not searched, then the FBI's statement is not exculpatory. It is a description of the boundaries of what was found, which is not the same as the boundaries of what exists. This distinction matters enormously for every case that touches the same network. For Diddy, currently serving 10 years and facing ongoing civil proceedings. For Jay-Z, whose name is in an active civil lawsuit and whose attorneys have been managing the narrative around him with increasing difficulty as the documentary series has expanded the public record of what was happening in the private rooms. For the unnamed individuals whose names appear in the sealed testimony that multiple sources have confirmed exists in the materials seized from Combs's properties, The Epstein files, now public, the Diddy documentary, ongoing, the KefD trial active, the storage lockers apparently never searched, the 140 hours of additional footage unreleased, all of it converging on March 30th, 2026 in the specific way that happens when multiple parallel investigations of interconnected networks begin producing documentation simultaneously and the structural picture starts becoming visible in a way that no individual piece of evidence could produce on its own. March 30th, 2026. The storage lockers may still exist. The CDs from Little St. James Island may still be in them. The computers that were moved before search warrants and cloned by forensic specialists may have their contents preserved somewhere in the chain of custody that the emails document. The material that Epstein's people were asking each other about in 2014, 2015, 2017, where it was, who had the keys, whether the codes had been changed, may be recoverable. Can authorities go and find this stuff now? That is the question being asked by the reporters covering the story and the investigators who were learning from the files what was apparently not searched the first time. The answer depends on what happened to those storage units in the years since Epstein's death in 2019. Whether they were emptied, by whom, under what circumstances, whether anyone maintained them, whether the paper trail of monthly payments was followed to a physical location, and whether that location was examined. These are answerable questions, not hypothetical questions about what powerful men might have done. Questions with specific addresses, specific lease records, specific key holders, specific access logs. Questions that the documentation now in public hands could help answer if the people responsible for answering them choose to pursue them with the same energy they brought to the aspects of the investigation that produced convictions and settlements and closed files. The shadow of what was not searched is still hanging over the Epstein case on March 30th, 2026. The shadow of what was captured and stored and potentially wiped or potentially preserved in storage lockers in Florida and New York, on cloned computer drives, in the recordings for motion-detected hidden cameras that were specifically requested to be very discreetly installed, is part of the landscape of a story that is not over, not for Epstein's network, not for the people whose names are in the sealed materials in the Diddy case, not for the individuals who are watching the Epstein files release and the documentary series and the KefDF testimony and calculating in the specific privacy of their own counsel's offices how exposed they are and what the documentation that they know exists somewhere says about what they knew and when they knew it. The ground is unstable on March 30th, 2026, not because of any single verdict or conviction or documentary episode, because of the accumulation of documented evidence that the most incriminating material from the most important cases of this era was specifically, deliberately, methodically moved to locations where it has not yet been found, and some of those locations may still be searchable. The question is whether anyone is going to look.